Hi, my name is Terry Janice, and this is Jill Dorfler. I'm Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and Jill is Ojibwe from here in White Earth, and an associate professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth. We've been hired to assist White Earth Nation and White Earth community members to develop an understanding about this proposed constitution that the White Earth tribe and their government has developed and is putting forward for a referendum vote. This constitution, this proposed constitution, was drafted in 2007, 2008, and 2009. The process of drafting it, as I've been told, is that the White Earth tribe asked every community council on White Earth to select 2 representatives to come and represent those communities in a drafting process of a new constitution. Each of the community councils did that. In addition to that, over 3 months, during 3 consecutive publications of the White Earth newspaper, the tribe asked community members to step forward and serve as delegates as well. And a number of them did in that process as well. Every person that stepped forward who was over 18 was allowed to serve as a delegate. And at the beginning of that Constitutional Convention process in 2007, there were 40 delegates, all of whom were tribal members, all of whom came at their own expense with some support for the cost of the conferences and meeting rooms and spaces and everything. That was paid for primarily with funds from the tribal council itself. And during that process, they had 4 separate meetings. During the first 3, there was a lot of conversation, I believe, about, how the specific details and issues were, how they were going to resolve them in a constitutional format, and a number of decisions were made in that process. After the 3rd one, they appointed a drafting committee. And this committee consisted of the primary drafter, who was a guy named Gerald Visner, who's a tribal member, professor in Native American literature, and at the time was at one of the UC California systems and living in Minneapolis. With him was Joanne Stately, who was working with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation as Vice President of Development, Anita Fine-Day, a tribal judge, and Jill Dorfler was brought in to advise on as a Native American professor at University of Minnesota Duluth, and David Wilkins, Native American professor at University of Minnesota in their American Indian Studies program. And so this group of 5 people created the first draft. They brought it back to the 4th convention. A number of reviews were made of it, some edits were made to it and changes to it, and then the final vote was had. At that last meeting, there were a total of 24 delegates that remained in the process, and in their vote to approve this, they voted 16 in favor and 8 opposed. And so that was the process of coming to this draft of the proposed constitution. It was drafted by tribal members that participated in that process and voted to approve it in its current form. From there, the intent was to move it to a referendum vote of all tribal members. And that vote has been scheduled by the White Earth Council for November 19th. They passed a resolution unanimously approving the referendum vote on November 19th, so just 3 months away from this date. And in that process, the specific intent is to vote on this proposed constitution up or down. The idea is that the work that the White Earth tribal members and the drafting committee did in drafting this should be voted on without additional change because they spent 2 whole years in the drafting process. And so between now and the vote on November 19th, there will be no additional changes. And so the opportunity is for all tribal members on White Earth to give voice to their either support or opposition to it. And as I said, that vote will happen on November 19th. And our goal here is simply to help to review the proposed Constitution. Myself and Jill were hired not to promote it one way or another. The funding for this effort came from a grant from the Bush Foundation. And just like a lot of other foundations, they are specifically prohibited from supporting any kind of lobbying or those kind of activities. And so all of our efforts, all of the materials do not take a position in support or opposition to any part of the Constitution. Our only commitment that we've made is that we want to make sure that it comes to a referendum vote of all tribal members so that the people of White Earth will decide for themselves. And we want to make sure that you have as many opportunities as possible to learn about this proposed Constitution. And so that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to go through the Constitution utilizing some materials that we've produced. And what we hope is that you will have this document. This is what we call the White Earth Proposed Constitution Workbook. And in this, what you'll see is the actual full text of the Constitution in the latter half of it, actually the mid-fold, and the actual text of the Constitution as it was approved and as you will be voting on it. And in the pages before that, we've summarized pieces of the Constitution with the idea that this is a big document and it's hard to kind of tackle it all in one setting. And so we wanted to break it up, and it kind of naturally breaks up into 6 sections. And so Jill and I are going to go through each of those 6 sections, one at a time. We may have a break in between just to, have a natural sort of beginning and end point. And then we'll go section by section. We've been doing these types of informational and education section using this workbook here on White Earth and in the other communities where there are a significant number of White Earth citizens or members. Minneapolis, Cass Lake, Iron Range, etc. And we've had a series of them with a number of people that have participated thus far. And with the referendum date being established, we're going to amplify and ratchet up our educational process so that there's more and more opportunity. As I said before, our position is not to support or oppose any part of the Constitution. It's merely to present the materials so that White Earth members have as many opportunities as possible to learn about it, to inform themselves about it, to have conversation about it, and arguments with each other, right? So that when it comes November 19 and it's the day to vote on this referendum, you will have reviewed it, have thought about it, and made up your own mind about whether you want to support this, approve it, or reject it. And the vote is completely yours. Your decision will decide what happens with this Constitution, and that's what we're here to support. So as a way of introduction, let me turn it over to you, to Jill, and introduce yourself and tell us what you think about this whole thing.
Thanks, Terry. Well, as Terry mentioned, I'm Jill Dorfler. I grew up in Mahnomen and went on to become a professor and faculty in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth campus. And I've been involved in the constitutional reform effort in a variety of ways since it began, the current effort that began in 2007. My dissertation research topic was on citizenship and identity, and so when Chairwoman Visner called for constitutional reform process to begin in 2007, I was interested in sharing some of the research that I had done to see how it might be useful during this process as well. So that's how I became involved, and continuing this summer with the education efforts, looking at the completion of the Constitution and helping people go through it to come to their own understanding and decision.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is kind of launch into it, and just the way Jill introduced herself a little bit more fully. Again, my name is Terry Janice. I'm Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm an attorney, graduated from the University of Arizona, and member of the State Bar of Arizona. Practice in indigenous law, indigenous rights law, both internationally and domestically here in the United States. Primarily focused on policy issues like constitutions and international legal mechanisms like declarations and conventions, as well as domestically here in the United States with a focus on land rights. So I come with that range of experience, also having a master's degree in education from Harvard University. So I've always tried to really balance that line between education and law. And that's what I bring to this task of informing and educating and getting information out as much as possible. So that is the first introductory part of our session. Hi, we're back. The first section that we're going to cover, as I said earlier, there are 6 different sections that we've organized the Constitution into. And the first one looks at issues of sovereignty and sovereign authority of the White Earth Nation. And we're going to cover the preamble, chapters 1, 4, and 5. And in your workbook and in whatever materials you have on the Constitution itself, take a look at the preamble. You'll see that it's a broad statement, just like a lot of constitutional preambles, that emphasizes 2 parts. The first is the kind of base or foundation of the Constitution based upon Anishinaabe culture, Anishinaabe traditions, and the history and content of Anishinaabe people. That as the basis of forming the purpose and intent of this Constitution. And then secondly, it also looks at the kind of issues that are normally found in the Constitution, securing the inherent and essential sovereignty, promote traditions of liberty, justice, etc. And that is essentially the kind of content of the preamble. Turn next to chapter 1 of the Constitution, again, which is on the workbook on page 18. Chapter 1 looks at the territory and jurisdiction. It's a broad assertion of jurisdiction over all land within the reservation boundaries. You'll see that it declares shall have jurisdiction over citizens, land, resources, etc., everything essentially. Established and described in the Treaty of March 19, 1867. The Treaty of March 19, 1867 is the treaty that establishes the White Earth Reservation and its current boundaries. So that it really encompasses all of the lands and resources within that. And it also asserts jurisdiction over the reserved rights within the ceded waterways and territories of the Treaty of 1855. And you should know that the Treaty of 1855 has language and has been held by U.S. courts to support the right of White Earth people to utilize the lands that they gave up, that they ceded in the Treaty of 1855, to utilize for traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering. And so those rights, which are sometimes called usufructuary rights in the court system, to utilize it for hunting, gathering, resource collection, etc., of traditional nature, is a part of the language of the Treaty of 1855. And this Constitution in Chapter 1 asserts jurisdiction over that and establishes a goal in that regard. One of the things that, as an attorney especially, you really need to be aware of is that because this asserts a jurisdiction over all lands within the White Earth Reservation boundaries, it establishes what I think of as a goal or a demand almost, that it is the intent of this Constitution to claim, reclaim, reestablish that jurisdiction within the boundaries of the White Earth Reservation. The fact of the matter is it doesn't change the current jurisdictional standards. The current jurisdictional standards under U.S. law establish that the White Earth Reservation, in any reservation, has jurisdiction, sovereign authority over those lands that are in trust, those lands that are Indian lands. So they're owned by the tribe in trust, or they're owned by individual landowners through allotments that are also in trust. And so it is that status that the tribe, as a sovereign government, has jurisdiction within. And within the White Earth Reservation, because of the General Allotment Act, White Earth and White Earth members lost the majority of their land base, and over 95% at the beginning, even more. And the current efforts of the White Earth tribe to reclaim and repurchase and get land back that was taken from them during the General Allotment Act of 1887 up until the Indian Reorganization Act, that process of reclaiming their land base has grown the land base to just over 10%. So the current amount of trust land, Indian land, that exists within the boundaries of the White Earth Reservation is about 10%. And that is the land that White Earth as a tribe has jurisdiction over. So just have to be clear on that. Even though this asserts jurisdiction over everything, it doesn't change federal law. It just can't. And you have to think of this language in Chapter 1 as a goal, as an aspiration, as a commitment to reestablish and reclaim, to assert it and demand it. And that's really how this language comes forward and how it has to be read. So that is Chapter 1. And now we're going to turn to Chapter 4 on page 20. And Chapter 4 looks at this idea of sovereign immunity. And the language reads that the White Earth Nation declares sovereign territorial, political, and cultural rights and powers as an independent government and immunity from civil lawsuits. The Legislative Council, by certain formal policies and procedures, shall have the right to waive the sovereign immunity of the government in the best interest of the White Earth Nation. And so what you see there is this idea of sovereign immunity. And in order to understand that, you have to understand that every sovereign in the world, whether it's Great Britain, the United States, Canada, every state in that regard, every sovereign has inherent sovereign authority. And because they have inherent sovereign authority, they also have what is called sovereign immunity. And what sovereign immunity means is that they are immune from suit, that they cannot be sued as a government unless they have a government give up or give that right to somebody to sue them. So for example, the federal government, if you were an employee of the United States government and you were wrongfully dismissed and you wanted to sue the U.S. government, the only way you would be able to sue the U.S. government is if the U.S. government waived its sovereign immunity for that limited purpose to allow you to sue them in that circumstance. And the United States has. Every government waives sovereign immunity for specific purposes. It helps with employee-employer relations. It helps with economic development opportunities, etc. It's an important part of what it means to be a government, to have that sovereign immunity, and to do good governance, wise governance, to make sure that the citizens and members of the tribe have the right to sue you, etc. But it's also particularly important for business opportunities and economic development. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that the very terms of this Constitution is a waiver of that sovereign immunity. Jill is going to go over in this next section some of the civil rights that individuals have as a part of this proposed Constitution. And all of those civil rights and other provisions in the Constitution is in and of itself a waiver of sovereign immunity, so that you can sue the White Earth government under this Constitution, and the courts have authority to decide those cases and interpret the Constitution and decide whether an action of the White Earth government is in violation of the Constitution. That's a part of the separation of powers and independent judiciary and the nature of what a Constitution does to preserve and protect the rights of its citizens. So all of those are a part of this conversation about sovereign immunity and go into your understanding of what it says here in the Constitution. Now the final chapter that we're going to look at in this section is Chapter 5. And what that looks at is the Board of Elections. And we cover it here because the electoral process is a very important and inherent part of the sovereignty and expression of sovereignty of the White Earth people and the White Earth government. And what you see in Chapter 5 is, in many ways, reflects the way any constitution operates. No constitution gives a ton of detail about how a particular policy or provision is going to be carried out. What they will do is what they do here. So if you look at page 21, Chapter 5, and you see on Article 4 that members of the Board of Elections shall ensure fair and impartial elections according to the Election Code and the Constitution of the White Earth Nation. So in that provision, you see a guarantee under this Constitution of fair and impartial elections. And that is the kind of core part of this particular chapter. And then it also describes the mechanism or the process for how fair and impartial elections are going to be achieved. And so in Article 1, or Article 2, you see election and voting procedures shall be established by an election code and managed by an independent board of elections appointed by the Legislative Council. So you see a process by which fair and impartial elections are intended to be achieved under this Constitution. It doesn't say what should be the content of that election code. It does say that the Legislative Council will draft that first election code, and the Board of Elections will be the body that's responsible for making sure that that election code is carried out. But what you see as the baseline is a guarantee of fair and impartial elections. And that's the basic way of how you have to read Chapter 5, what it means in that context, and how a constitution operates in general. So the next section that we're going to cover looks at citizens' rights and protections, and we're going to take a brief pause and then turn that over to Jill.